Well, I'm very happy to be here today talking to you about technology. I think it's a fitting way to end our time together, because just as the arc of history bends towards justice, the arc of technology bends toward innovation and progress. And we've really seen tremendous amounts of progress in our industry across the entire supply chain related to technology over the last few decades, whether it's grinding technology, espresso making technology, brewing, whether it's data platforms that help us improve roasting and sourcing and traceability of coffee. We have seen the pace of innovation change rapidly. And that's the case, like I said, pretty much across the entire supply chain, except for one very key important place: the seed, the plant. We don't tend to think of this as being a technology, but it is. A plant, a seed, is kind of like a tiny miracle. It's a time capsule, it's a history book, it's also like a little computer. Inside the coffee seed is a vastly complex set of genetic data that creates the blueprint for everything that's possible in coffee. The stimulating effects of caffeine, the enormous array of flavors and aromas that we know and love in coffee. Some of us might be familiar with the fact that coffee has almost 1,000 identified volatile organic compounds, which is more than almost any other food or beverage product we consume, including wine or chocolate. And also, of course, health-promoting antioxidant qualities that keep coffee in the news repeatedly. So the seed is really an amazing vehicle and piece of technology. And I would argue that it's not just a technology, it's in fact the most important technology in our entire sector. It may seem too obvious to even say out loud, but without the coffee plant, there is no roasting machine. Without the coffee plant, there's no grinder. Without the coffee plant, there's no data systems to improve traceability. So it's the core technology, the foundational, fundamental technology in our sector. And unfortunately, it's also the most neglected. The coffee plant is profoundly out of date. Most of the varieties that are grown around the world today are based on the same small set of genes and genetics that have been around since the beginning of our sector 250 years ago. This is all the more problematic because the challenges facing the plant are greater now than they've ever been before. Most of you, I'm willing to bet, would not run your business just with a paper and pen anymore, right? That's technology from 1,000 years ago. We have better ways of doing things. But all of you are running your businesses on a technology that is out of date, whether you realize it or not. And this is extremely problematic right now because the plant is facing challenges that it has never faced before. Climate change and rising temperatures are putting increasing amount of pressures on the plant. Warmer temperatures make it hard for the plant to respirate, to breathe. They also have an impact on quality. When temperatures go up, the fruit ripens more rapidly, and it doesn't have time to produce those lovely, volatile, organic compounds that make it so nuanced and so prized by us. Rising temperatures happen slowly over time. Droughts and disease epidemics can wipe out an entire farm in a matter of weeks or months. And we've recently seen tremendous proof of this with the leaf rust crisis in Central America between 2012 and now. We've lost almost an entire coffee-producing region in El Salvador, and there are many other parts of the world that are suffering tremendously because of it. So the plant, as we know it now, is not up to the challenges of the 21st century. And this is problematic because the amount of innovation that has happened around this core technology, the plant, is so incredibly low. Because it is a technology, we know that we can innovate, we know that we can improve it, but that isn't happening. How do I know that? Because we can actually measure the amount of innovation that is happening in the coffee plant and compare it to other kinds of innovation in our sector. How do we do that? We can look at intellectual property filings. So intellectual property is a broad category of protections for all sorts of creations, inventions, creative works, copyright, trademarks, patenting. So if we want to look at the amount of innovation, for example, in brewing technology, we can look at patent filings, right? Intellectual property laws protect creations and new works so that the creators of them are able to generate profit, and that incentivizes the creation of new works, right? So new inventions are protected by patents, And we can look at patent filings to see, relatively, get a kind of a pulse on the amount of innovation taking place, for example, in brewing technology. But what about plants? So brewing, a new brewer, for example, might have an inventor or an engineer behind it, but what about a plant? Well, a plant has a breeder behind it. Pictured here is Norman Borlaug. He's one of the most famous plant breeders of all time. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for creating new varieties of wheat and rice and other staple food crops that enabled, they say, 1 billion human lives to be saved through increased production. And those are his tools. So I want to be clear that today, when I'm talking about the development of new varieties of coffee and new varieties of plants, I'm talking about using traditional breeding methods, using basically the same tools that Norman Borlaug used. I'm not talking about genetic modification, although that is one way that you can create a new variety of plant. So these are his tools: scalpel, scissors, paintbrush, so you can take pollen from one plant, paint it onto another, and help those plants reproduce. A breeder is basically just a glorified matchmaker. They're humans who enable plants to have better sex, right? So a breeder creates a new variety. What is the intellectual property framework that protects them? Well, there is an international framework called the Union for the Protection of the Variety of Plants, or UPOV, after the French acronym. And when a breeder creates a new variety of plant, they can register that plant in UPOV, and the participating countries will respect that plant breeder's rights, and they can do things, for example, like commercialize the plant themselves. They could license it to a seed company to commercialize it for them and earn a royalty, or they could choose to give it away for free. The point is, it's their decision to make. So now we have these two things that we can look at to compare the amount of innovation happening, for example, in brewing technology and in the coffee plant itself. So what do we see? How under-innovated is the coffee plant compared to other technologies in our sector? Well, when I did a search at the US Patent Office for coffee machine, I came up with 3,352 patents that have been filed since 1976 to today. This represents both the US and China. And so this is not exactly a measure of how much innovation has happened. I didn't search for every possible term. I didn't search for coffee grinder or espresso machine, but it gives us a rough amount, a rough sense of where that innovation trajectory has been for brewing technology. So let's turn and look at plants. How many coffee varieties have been filed in UPOV? 36. 1%. 1% the amount of innovation on the plant as in brewing technologies. Again, these are not exact numbers. We know that there's more than 36 coffee varieties out there, but this gives us a rough measure. And you could argue, perhaps fairly, that that's not a fair comparison. It's apples to oranges. So I can meet you there too. Let's look at another crop. For no particular reason other than that they are a tasty summer snack and they are somewhat comically larger than a coffee bean, so they make a good slide. We're going to look at watermelons. So we already know 36 coffee varieties filed in UPOV. How many watermelons? 2,690, again, roughly 1%. Now, this is all the more astounding when you consider the relative economic and social importance of the coffee plant versus the watermelon. The watermelon is a snack you bring out at parties in the summer. Coffee is something that we drink every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. These numbers represent the value of each of these crops. The retail value in the US, $74 billion for coffee, $521 million for watermelons. So why is this? Why is coffee so under-innovated when we compare it to other technologies in our supply chain and when we compare it to other crops? There's a few reasons. One of them is that coffee is produced in relatively poor countries that don't have large established infrastructures for agricultural research. Watermelons, for example, are mostly grown in the US, in Turkey, and in China. And they have very sophisticated research infrastructures in all three of those countries. When coffee is researched, it tends to be researched by public institutions in coffee-producing countries. Two excellent examples of where great coffee research is done are Sena Cafe in Colombia and Embrapa, a consortium of research universities in Brazil. But, as you might imagine, Those are publicly funded institutions in those countries, and so the work that's done is really done for the benefit of producers in those countries. There have been some cases where, for example, a new variety developed in Brazil was transferred to other countries, but for the most part, if you're a farmer in Burundi, you're not getting the benefit of innovation that's happening in Brazil or in Colombia. 2, we've just been really damn lucky, right? The climate and the conditions of the 20th century have been well suited to the plant that we have now. Unfortunately, we know that that's starting to change. So the coffee leaf rust epidemic of 2012 has been called the canary in the coal mine. We know that temperatures are rising and that farmers at low elevations are beginning to pull coffee out and replace it with other crops that they're able to grow at those elevations with those higher temperatures. So our luck is sort of run out. We can't keep working with the same material that we've had. And 3, there has been virtually no private sector investment in agricultural research in coffee. Almost all of it has been done by private sector institutions, especially in coffee-producing countries. When you compare the amount of innovation in R&D happening in crop research, for example, in corn, in watermelons, the percentages are staggeringly different than they are for coffee. So these are 3 reasons why we see this issue. This is all the more frustrating because we know that investing in agricultural research is one of the best investments you can make in your supply chain. This is a number from the World Bank. Different studies place the number in different places, but they're all basically around this range, 35 to 50% return on agricultural research. That's a pretty good return. So what's possible? Well, just to stick with the example of the watermelon, you can dramatically change a plant when you invest in breeding. So on the left here, you see what the watermelon used to look like 5,000 years ago before humans started selecting it. It was very different from the watermelon of today. It was very tough. It was very, very bitter. Didn't taste anything like what we know. You actually needed a hammer to open it. And of course, on the right, you have the modern watermelon. Applying modern breeding techniques, watermelon breeders have been able to create things like single-serving watermelons, right? So you don't have to have an entire party in your backyard to eat one. You can have one as an after-dinner snack. They've been able to create watermelons with orange flesh and yellow flesh, serving all different sorts of needs and markets. So you can change the plant. You can also change outcomes for farmers. This is a graph representing corn yields over the last 100 or so years. And you can see right around 1940, theories of modern genetics, again, same traditional techniques of selectively breeding, not using GMOs, but just applying theories of modern genetics and creating hybrid varieties of corn. Over the last 60 years, corn yields in the US have increased 6-fold. So that's not even necessarily where we're aiming, but imagine how the impact that it would have if we could double coffee yields for smallholders. Of course, low innovation isn't no innovation. There are coffee breeders in the world, and there have been for the last 100 or so years. So we can see that there have been kind of 4 main historical stages of coffee breeding. The one you may be the most familiar with started around the middle of the last century to create new varieties of Arabica that would be resistant to coffee leaf rust. These are the Catamore and Sarchamore-like varieties. They're very good for farmers in the sense that they're resistant to this major disease. Unfortunately, they often have very low cup quality. So the modern era of breeding coffee, the one that we're in now, is looking at new techniques for maintaining things like yield and disease resistance that benefit farmers, but also incorporating things like quality that really matter for the folks here in this room. What can we achieve if we can do a better job of investing in R&D and in applying the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of techniques that have been applied to other crops in coffee? Well, we can create higher yields for farmers. We can create new kinds of disease resistance for farmers. We can create better quality coffees, and we're going to have to create coffees that are resilient in the face of climate change, that are tolerant to drought. So this is where we're aiming. And I want to talk for just a second about some of the things that World Coffee Research has been doing to enable this future to become possible. You can't do it in a vacuum. We need new tools and we need new technologies to underpin a modern breeding program for coffee. So what are they? You heard yesterday about the sensory lexicon and the ways that it's being applied in the industry to improve outcomes for cup quality. But actually, very few people know this, the reason we created it was to support our breeding program. We created it so that we would have a tool to look at existing varieties of coffee, potential parents for that matchmaking process that I mentioned, to be able to say what do these taste like, and to be able to measure whether those quality attributes are coming down in the children when we're creating new varieties of coffee in those breeding programs. So it's a screening tool that we can use to ensure that the highest possible quality is being replicated in new varieties. Something most people don't know about the history of coffee breeding. One reason why Catamore type, Sarchamore type varieties don't taste very good is because nobody was trying to make them taste good. They started being developed in the 60s and 70s when specialty coffee didn't even exist, right? And if you don't try for an outcome, you're often not going to get it. So just by having a tool that lets us put quality at the center, we can create new varieties of coffee that are higher quality. We also need genetic diversity. Just like an engineer needs parts, breeders need plants. They need a pool of potential plants to choose from to create new varieties, and they want that pool to have the maximum amount of genetic diversity possible. Why? Your genes are your toolkit. If you have a screwdriver, you can do some stuff. If you have a screwdriver and a hammer and a wrench, you can do a hell of a lot more. So by increasing the genetic diversity of the pool of coffees that breeders are choosing from to create new varieties, we can potentially find novel genetic traits that allow, for example, the plant to make better use of water resources, which will help it in a drought. So over the last year, we've been genetically sequencing a very large collection of Arabica varieties, almost 1,000, to try to find which of them have the most genetic diversity. We found a group of 50 that represent about 90% of the diversity available out of that 1,000, and we're going to use those as our breeding pool. We're going to use them for varieties that we're working on, but we're also going to make that pool available to breeders around the world who are also working on trying to create better varieties for farmers in their countries. And we can steal good ideas from other people. So other crops have been using molecular breeding techniques for a number of years with great success. That's how those single-serve watermelons were created. And in coffee, this is especially important because traditional breeding takes almost 30 years. The plant, because it's a tree crop, takes 3 years to mature and produce new fruit. And because breeders have to work over successive generations to make sure that the right characteristics are being carried through, it can take up to 30 years to create a new variety. Catuai, for example, began being developed in Brazil in 1948. It was not released to farmers until the 1970s. That is a hugely problematic time lag, right? Imagine running your business where you weren't able to solve problems until 30 years after they emerged. So using molecular breeding techniques where we're able to screen plants for particular molecular markers that tell us things like, oh, this is drought tolerant, or oh, this is going to have resistance to coffee leaf rust, allows us to shorten that time and improve outcomes for farmers and for industry. But of course, every good technology needs a manual. And all of these breeding programs I'm talking about do take time, and we do have good varieties that exist, better varieties than many farmers know exist. And so I'm very pleased to announce that today we are launching a coffee variety catalog for Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. This is a catalog that describes the agronomic properties of about 33 key varieties in the region and gives farmers good information to make informed decisions about which varieties are going to be right for them on their farm, in their situation, for their particular practices. It's available for free on our website to download, and we hope that it will make its way into the hands of many tens of thousands of farmers. We encourage you, if you work with farmers, to use this tool with them. So what does the future look like? Well, solving this problem, resolving this issue of the under-innovation of the core fundamental technology in our sector is the reason that World Coffee Research was created. It was a way to enable investment from the private sector to happen at the very beginning of our supply chain. Can we improve the coffee plant? Absolutely. We know we can do it. Many, many other crops are light years ahead of where we are in coffee. What can we achieve if we do it? Well, higher yields, disease resistance, climate tolerance, all of the things that farmers need and that we need together to keep the industry moving forward over the next 100 years. So we can do it. The problem is, will we do it? So that's the challenge I want to leave you with today. I think, do we want to be leaving innovation in this core technology to struggling public governments in producing countries? I don't think so. I think this is our opportunity to be engaged with this issue and to have a say in what the future of coffee looks like. Thank you.